Well, welcome back to the University of Washington Tacoma's Labor Solidarity Project's lecture series, Redefining American Labor. Tonight, we're honored to host David Jepsen, who is a local historian, an educator, and most importantly, a UW alumni. David, he's the co-author of Contested Boundaries, A New Pacific Northwest History, which is an outstanding regional survey that is actually currently being used regularly in 17 colleges and universities throughout Washington. But David is here with us tonight to share his latest, and I think, and he could nod if he agrees, maybe most ambitious work, which is, give me a thumbs up, which is Labor Wars of the Northwest, the struggle that defined the region, which is it's a painstakingly researched documentary that explores the formation of our regional economies, and it culminates in the 1919 general strike. I've had the good fortune of seeing this one a few times, and I have always left very impressed. I think it is, it's a necessary contribution to our understanding of both local and national labor politics. And I think, as somebody who teaches labor history, it exhumes a past that we really need to know. I'm always surprised by just how many of my students have never even heard of the general strike of 1919, let alone, the Everett massacre. This is important history, and I think it's as important now as it has ever been. And I think to David's credit, it's a really engaging history of our region. And I think throughout the storytelling is just really fantastic. And so I am extremely honored that David is here with us tonight. So go ahead and hit your clap emojis and welcome David Jepsen to the seminar. I think in terms of formatting what we're gonna do, because we've got about 60 minutes worth of documentary to view, 65 minutes. So we're gonna let it run as quickly as possible to save time for a Q&A after the fact. So with that being said, the same rules still apply. If you have questions from the audience, go ahead and type them in the chat. Casey and I will do our best to sort of synthesize those and work them into the conversation after the fact. But again, just really excited to have you here with us tonight, David.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. The union is behind us, we shall not be moved. The union is behind us, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We're building a mighty union, we shall not be moved. Building a mighty union, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
On September 8, 1883, at Gold Creek in Montana Territory, a crowd of foreign dignitaries and politicians, including former President Ulysses S. Grant, watched as railroad magnate Henry Villard pounded the last spike in the Northern Pacific Railroad line connecting St. Paul, Minnesota with Puget Sound. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in the Pacific Northwest, igniting the region's economy and creating an untold number of jobs. Workers poured into the region by the thousands, but instead of the security of a steady job, workers found poverty-level wages, crushing hours, and dreadful conditions. So they protested, picketed, and struck. They sang in the streets, troubadours with a cause, and they bled. Struck down in cities like Spokane, Everett, and Centralia. And at the battle's peak, they shut down a city. 65,000 workers, men and women, standing together, united. It was intended as a blow against exploitation, a fight for dignity and pay equity, a precursor to revolution. It was the Seattle General Strike. For 6 days in February 1919, Seattle was closed for business. Virtually all businesses and all but the most essential city services shut down. America and much of the world watched as workers struck for a living wage, for reasonable hours, and for the right to organize. The working class stood up to capitalist and government forces and walked off the job. This is their story, the labor wars of the Northwest.
This was a time where, not just in Seattle, but across the United States, and for that matter, the Western world, a vibrant economic change and growth.
The Pacific Northwest was rapidly expanding in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. But we don't see the large industries like you see in Chicago or New York. You know, there's not huge factories, where women would be working by the thousands.
The Yukon and Klondike gold strikes propelled Seattle to new economic heights. Between 1900 and 1910, its population tripled to over 237,000, bypassing Portland as the region's largest city. City leaders embarked on civic improvements, beginning with the massive regrade of downtown to expand the commercial district. In 1909, they hosted the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, Seattle's first World's Fair, permanently linking its fate with Alaska. 5 years later, the 42-story Smith Tower opened, making Seattle the home of America's tallest building outside of New York City. Its grandeur symbolized Seattle's emergence as a vital metropolis and permanent force in global trade. But much of the success came on the backs of the working poor.
As more and more workers are going from farms or going from being independent craftsmen into the factory, they start using the term wage slavery because it has some cultural currency.
Workers coming and settling in Washington State and Seattle often had high hopes. They were going to find great jobs, and wages were higher in the West than they were elsewhere. That's one of the big reasons for coming. But then prices could be higher too. So there was often disappointment over what the working conditions and wages were.
Well, part of the problem is that the cycles of good times and bad times were hellaciously close together in the Pacific Northwest.
All right. Well, let's all raise a clap emoji for David's film. That was absolutely fantastic. And David, if you don't mind, you've taken yourself off mute.
Thank you. I have, yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this work and for sharing it with us tonight. We do have a number of student questions rolling in here, student and public audience questions here. And I want to be mindful of time. The last time David and I did an event, we wound up doing a Q&A that went an hour over the time the Washington State History Museum closed. So let's get right into it, if you don't mind. Ashley had a great question, and I'm actually gonna unmute you, Ashley, if you're ready to pose it. Let me just click on this. Excellent. Ashley, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, thanks. David, thanks for putting this together and sharing it with us tonight. Earlier in the documentary, the narration was talking about the fact that a lot of unions were segregationist, that they were white only. Can you talk a little bit about alternative organizations, not just segregated unions, but other types of entities, like ways that people came together to build community, to advocate for one another and support one another in terms of the labor market specifically amongst communities of color?
Well, I can to a limited extent. I have read a little bit about the African American alternative organization, the CMEBA.
Mm-hmm.
These were maritime stewards, cooks, who were trying to create an alternative to organized labor. They actually were put off by the strikes, by the militancy, and split off from the Steward Cooks Union. and will eventually join with that union and in the 1930s. So there were alternatives available. Because the mainstream unions were focused on white men only and white men with skills. So if you're unskilled or a person of color, you're gonna have limited opportunity. I would offer that the IWW was probably the leading alternative. They attracted people from all walks of life and of all ethnicities. I don't know if Alex, you want to add to that a little?
No, but I do think your film makes an excellent case for the way that sort of capital leveraged race to sort of divide labor, right?
Yeah, very, very much so. And that's the story we wanted to tell. My editors and I decided very early on that this could not be a video about white men strictly. The wobbly story has been told in many different places in many different ways. Women have gotten much less coverage, but more so than people of color. And so that's was our effort, was to try and describe the experience of men and women, African Americans, Native Americans, and of course Asian immigrants. And so yeah, we got started on that, but there's a lot more work to do.
Well, and I think that's where the strike of 1919 comes in. It sort of acts like it has this sort of centripetal force that pulls together so many workers from so many walks of life, right? Wasn't that sort of, what made the general strike so successful was solidarity across those racial lines, right?
Absolutely. General strikes are almost impossible to pull off without that kind of solidarity. But it didn't last long, did it? I mean, we're talking about 2 or 3 or 4 days, and it was the first general strike in U.S. history, and probably still one of the largest. But historians disagree as to whether or not it had any sort of lasting impact on the working experience.
Excellent. I had another question queued up here, and another student who I asked to pose the question themselves. So Hank, if you're still in the room, see if I can unmute you, assuming you're ready to go.
While you're looking for Hank, Alex, I want to heads up to Tom Lux. I see Tom is in the audience. Tom is president of the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association, and helped to support this program. We don't have labor wars in Northwest without the association and the direction and help from the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association. So I want to thank them while they're on.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, for your support. This is a fantastic film. Let me unmute Hank here, who has a question.
Hello.
Hank, you there?
Yeah.
Hi, Hank.
Hi. Thanks for speaking with us today. My question was, during this time, how did labor groups and movements deal with being labeled as socialist or leftist? And did that disrupt labor movements?
Yeah, I would call it one of the principal disruptors, if that's the word you like. I mean, we have to put this story in the context of its time, which coincides or overlaps with the Russian Revolution and the atrocities that come out of that with the Bolsheviks. Americans were horrified by what was going on in Russia. And so anybody with any sort of leftist ideas were labeled as a socialist or communist. And they didn't make a distinction between those two things, right? Socialists were communists and vice versa. And so if you're a labor activist and vocalizing your discontent with your working condition, you are usually quickly discounted as a communist.
Thank you.
Excellent. I feel like that question sort of has a lot of resonance today too, in terms of any sort of movement for a more progressive political agenda, how quickly that becomes sort of painted with this broad brush of socialism and is immediately sort of written off. And I think you see it, of course, with World War II, in the Red Scare, right?
World War II, World War I, Wilson, President Wilson enacted a series of highly regressive laws that prohibited free speech. In the Red Scare in the 1950s, there's a kind of a redo of that. And now I'm seeing it again now. Our extremists of political parties today, the American right is quick to label progressive movements as socialist. You can expect that word to be repeated over and over again in the 2020 election. I think politicians are going to use that fear, that long-held fear and suspicion and contempt for progressive thinking, leftist thinking, as a weapon.
Nice. And I think that, I mean, in addition to just being, masters of the media in terms of using music to advance their agenda, the Wobblies they were really talented at sort of plugging into some of those like core American ideas surrounding, just what freedom means, what free speech means, sort of appropriating, the Battle Hymn of the Republic for Solidarity Forever, this idea of, that organizing and that sort of this, what would be called sort of socialism today is actually sort of fundamentally, written into the American DNA, that, that this nation is sort of based on, responding to overthrowing tyrannical methods of control, right? And it's, that was sort of their approach to sort of looking at, redressing the exploitation of labor.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not sure I have a comment on that, but Americans are good at repression in a democracy.
Yeah. All right, I've got one more question from a student who I cleared. This is going to be Brandon. Let me see if I can find your name here. Oh, Brandon, here we go. Brandon, are you with us?
Yeah, I am.
All right.
Hi, Brandon.
Hi, that was interesting, by the way. I have a question. Are today's today's working conditions better because of what the IWW did a century ago, or could they have gotten better like without the IWW?
I say one of those yes and no questions, and like economists, you never ask them a question because on one hand they'll say and on the other hand, right? So there's split thinking on the effectiveness of the Wobbly. So we can I think argue safely that the IWW itself had minimal long-term impact because they were more interested in disrupting the system than fixing it. That's one point of view. But there's no question that the union movements of the turn of the century and then in the Great Depression will have a long-term impact on improvement of labor in terms of these what Zach Patton called bread and butter issues, wages, hours, workplace safety. And so in an industrialized economy, we see better working conditions. The factories became more safe. The unions managed to negotiate higher wages. We see the rise in things like pensions and vacation, all kinds of benefits. And so are the workers, is the working conditions better today? Well, today we're in a service economy, and that's kind of the good news and bad news for the worker. The good news is that working in an office or in a service economy or in sales is inherently more safe than working in a coal mine or in a forest or on the docks. So is the workers' conditions better? Absolutely. But the the downside of the service economy is that the companies have found the ways to not unionize workers. There's a perception now that unions are not necessary, that they kind of overstayed their welcome. And we've seen a steady drop in union participation. Now we're down to below 10%. So just 1 in 10 workers are represented by a union. So the worker today, that gig worker working at home or at Amazon or the Uber driver, these workers, are they safer? Sure. Do they have a living wage? Not sure about that. Do they have control over the workplace? Not sure about that either. Kind of like those workers of 100 years ago. If you're an Uber driver or if you're working in an Amazon factory, you can be fired without cause or let go. And you can have your wages reduced. I just read today that Uber let go 17,000 of its drivers, something like that. You're asking a complicated question, Brad, but I would say, yeah, we're more, it's working is easier today. Life is easier, right? In a service economy. Don't put me on a forest. I'll lose a hand in about 2 hours, right? But we're still facing some of these same issues in terms of control over the workplace, the dignity in the workplace. I was mentioning to Alex earlier, how would you like to be working in a meat processing plant today? If you go down to Walla Walla where they're processing poultry, these workers are shoulder to shoulder, working all day on their feet for $15 an hour. And that work these people are at the bottom of the economic labor ladder. And then this coronavirus hits. And that shows the vulnerability of today's workers in settings, in factory settings and these meat processing plants.
Nice. I was just talking to Casey sort of in the chat room privately, just commenting on your film and how sort of, how visceral some of the images that you managed to include in this documentary, between the images and the video footage, and just how powerful those images are in terms of taking you to the actual, the lived experience of those workers and like you just said, the danger in that work. And I think you're spot on in terms of sort of diagnosing this, that there's work today that is equally as dangerous, but we don't get to see it. It's because those companies have these, metal detectors as you walk into the rendering plants. Like you don't actually, we have the average American has very little sense of just how exploitative and oppressive some of those industries actually are.
Yeah, they're out of, you're right, they're out of sight. And the recent struggles with the coronavirus has compelled me to start taking a closer look at some of these industries. I love Amazon. My wife and I, we do a lot of shopping, and I can order a book and get it in 24 hours. I can get a used one for a book I want for $6 and have it delivered. I enjoy my beef and pork and fowl, and I think we need to take a closer look behind those products and how they're delivered to the market.
Yeah. We've got one more question from a student here. Mylin, let me unmute you here. Mylin, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Jepsen. Well, it almost feels like you've sort of answered the question already, but I'll go ahead and say it. Is the Pacific Northwest ripe for new labor wars? And if so, which industries do you think would be involved? Thank you.
Wow. I don't know whether I could single out the Pacific Northwest. We focused on the Northwest because we had the centennials coming up with the Seattle General Strike and then the Centralia's tragedy. I had been hoping or planning or thinking about idea of creating this film for quite some time, and then the centennials gave me a reason to why to do it now. And it was like, do it now, Jepsen, or forget it forever, right? So clearly there were wars a century ago under the most difficult conditions. And I think it's the difficulty of the conditions, the experience in which we're under now could lead to more pushback and more activity and activism on the labor front. You're certainly seeing it with teachers. You're seeing it with nurses, and I think the coronavirus it multiplies these problems by 10, and we're going to see it coming out of some of these commodity products like fowl and beef, farm workers, healthcare. So I would expect, I would not be surprised to see a 21st century version of a labor war. Whether it's going to involve shooting in the streets, I don't know about that. I mean, a century ago, Americans were killing Americans on city streets in like Everett and Spokane and Centralia. I'm not sure we're going to have that kind of war, but I expect a heightened level of labor activism here certainly over the next 3 to 5 years.
Do you have time for one more?
I do, and I also have, and I see some of my students are checked in. If any students for Tacoma Community College or South Puget Sound College have a question, you can make me look good by asking decent questions here.
You're doing a good job of that yourself. Well, while they get tuned up, if they're going to ask questions, I have a question, and I think, as somebody who does teach sort of local labor history, why are these stories always so new to my students? Why are students arriving at the university level without sort of a knowledge of this history that is like, I mean, it couldn't be more local. And it's, and I mean, these are, I feel like, inspiring stories that deserve to be told.
Yeah, no question about it. Well, I can, one of the reasons I did this film was because I needed better tools to teach labor history. Labor history is really not being taught at the community college level, certainly not in high schools. But when you're teaching Pacific Northwest history, labor is a central story to how the Pacific Northwest became the way it is today, right? And how it shaped the region and its economy. And so I have a lecture on labor in my Pacific Northwest class. And a few quarters ago, it's actually been a few years ago, I gave my lecture, got my PowerPoint slides. I'm rocking and rolling, talking about individualism and mutualism and the rise of the union movement and power of the many and all that. And I had a student raise his hand in the back and said, "Mr. Jepsen, what's a union?" And I was kind of blown away by that question. And I began to think about it. A lot of my students they work in service, especially my older students. They're clearly not organized. Very likely their parents are not either, maybe even not their grandparents. So we are in a situation now where we can go back 2 or 3 generations where unions are not a part of the mainstream or a fact of life in many workers. So that's what caused me to really rethink how I told the labor story. And so I started showing the film, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York in 1909. And that's a great video. If anybody, if you haven't seen it, watch it. 144 women are burned alive or fall to their death from a 20-story building or 12-story building. And I tell my students, the issues are the same, but they're not sewing garments. They're not making dresses or blouses. They're cutting trees and digging coal, but the issues are the same. And so we just don't have the tools to tell the labor story to a 21st century audience. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to make this film.
Nice. I think you told me that story the first time we met, and it was like, well, I wanted to teach this. There wasn't a movie about it, so I made a movie about it. I always thought that was pretty inspiring. It's like, if something's not there that you need, go ahead and make it.
Yeah, it was my first film, and probably my last. Filmmaking is not like writing a book, right? It's a lot more involved and more challenging in different kind of ways, but it was a great experience.
Well, it looks like one of your students, Carly, chimed in just to say that she loved the film. We did have a question earlier, just in terms of logistics. How did you manage to assemble all of the material to make this film? I mean, the archival footage, but then getting the cast of sort of local labor experts together.
Yeah, it was hard, right? Because certainly all the primary characters, the people who are actually there, are gone. And a matter of fact, a lot of the experts, the people we interviewed, were getting on in years as well. As in fact, we lost two between the time we interviewed them and the film being debuting last February. David Dilgard, a great Pacific Northwest historian at Everett, died, and then so did Ron Magden. I see one of our people with us tonight mentioned Ron. So it gives you a sense just how these were historians who 30, 40 years ago interviewed the Ralph Millers and some of the other characters who were young men in the early 20th century. And then my editor, excuse me, I'm forgetting his name for it this second, but we just went on a search. There's a huge treasure trove of both still photographs and video footage. Interestingly, the video itself was really hard to get and very expensive. Some of that footage you saw of Seattle and Centralia were held by archivists, and they preserve it in vaults. The stuff from Seattle General Strike, get ready for it, $12 a second.
Oh, wow.
And so this is an expensive proposition, and we know that we couldn't just have talking heads. We had to really go out of our way to find visuals to support the story.
Excellent. Well, again, I think you told the story, in vivid detail. I think it's like I said at the outset, this is an incredibly important history that everybody needs to know. And again, we're just so honored that you came in this evening and shared this with this group. So again, raise an emoji applause for David Jepsen. Thanks so much for participating in our seminar.
Thank you. And thanks to the University of Washington, Tacoma, and for all your efforts, Alex.
Excellent. Thanks.